This is a final look at diagrams about the four centers, picking up where we left off after part 2. This is to show, you can see all the little eyes, the mini eyes represented here from the centers. And on the right side, just to clarify that each center has 4 parts. And that's how this is. The situation is just a little difficult to render when it comes to the intellectual center on the left. But the same applies. It also has 4 parts. And the idea is, in the fourth way, that an impulse from any center can arise, and then it will form as an I, a feeling of I. That may be a sensation, but it's still, we associate a sense of I with a sensation, with a movement, anytime we make a movement, certainly with our emotions and with our thoughts. It's also the case that often an impulse will arise in the instinctive, the moving, or the emotional center, all of which are wordless. The instinctive center is just sensations, the moving center is just movement, and emotions are not words. They're more ethereal, they're feelings. Nevertheless, all 3 of these centers, what happens is when an impulse arises in them, they conjoin with the intellectual center, which says I. And in our head, it will say, I'm happy, I'm sad, I need to go now, I'm hungry, I'm tired. And so this is an example of how the centers combine when they function. This happens within fractions of a second. We don't notice all these different connections. We barely notice where these impulses arise from. They all end up as a feeling of I. And that's what we're looking at here is I. And this is where we live. This is our life in the second state of consciousness according to the fourth way. Consciousness is asleep in us or very dim in us. And to the extent that it is alert, it is identified with what it sees. And what it sees are these impulses, and these impulses taking form as a sense of I. Our consciousness identifies with that, becomes that feeling of I, and that's how the ego forms, or what the fourth way calls imaginary picture of oneself. This is the same diagram, of course, but on the top left you see in the rectangular box there, that's meant to represent observing I. And in the fourth way, what happens is, this is the idea of self-observation, is we begin now to observe ourselves a little more impartially, instead of just believing every I that comes through the body and the mind through the 4 lower centers, and instead of attaching ourselves to it completely, we start to observe each of these I's. And at first this happened in the form of an observing I. It's as though one I, or a group of I's, in the intellectual part of a center or the intellectual parts of centers, begins to coalesce with this knowledge about self-observation and about consciousness and about the functioning of the 4 centers. And we begin to consolidate observations here and kind of do an analysis of what we're seeing, and not overanalyzing, of course, but in terms of where did that I come from? Is that an emotional I? Was that an instinctive I? Is that an intellectual I? And we sort of start to organize and catalog our observations. This takes place as in a feeling of now I am the observer, and that's sort of correct, but it's really still one of the I's, or it's a group of I's within the lower centers, the 4 centers. And this can gradually expand, this feeling of observing I. It can get larger and larger, occupy more space particularly in the intellectual center and the emotional center. So it can start to cover more of this ground and be more and more familiar with the different I's. Also, through self-observation, what happens is, the more we realize we can observe what we're seeing in ourselves in the 4 centers, the more we can intuit ourselves as the observer. Now there's some space between these impulses in all these eyes, and our ability to see them, to observe them. As that space opens up, our sense of being the observer comes more into focus, becomes more clear. And the idea of the progression in the fourth way is that through what I just mentioned, this space opening up, we becoming more cognizant of being the observer, this starts to introduce, or it becomes more obvious what self-remembering means. Self-remembering really means consciousness itself, becoming conscious of being conscious. It becomes conscious as the observing awareness that's looking at all the eyes and looking at the four centers. And as Mr. Ouspensky said, real self-remembering is above centers. It's not in the centers. It begins there. Often it begins in the intellectual or emotional center as a feeling of wishing to observe and trying to observe oneself. And then it transforms, you could say, into the realization of consciousness, being conscious. And so this diagram, you can see consciousness actually surrounds the four centers. Initially it started, if you will, inside the centers themselves. It started as observing eye, a feeling of observing among the eyes, kind of swimming with the fish, but noticing all the fish. And now it has stepped outside of the lake. And it's the consciousness, that is, has steps outside of the lake, is surrounding it and realizing that all of this that it's been observing is actually inside of it. It is a world inside of itself. So this physical and psychological world of the mind and body actually resides inside the realm of consciousness. It's a different dimension. The four centers are one dimension, and actually the body, the instinctive and moving centers, are one dimension inside of the psychological, the emotional and intellectual centers. And then all of them, all four, are inside of consciousness itself, which is a higher dimension. In part 2 of this presentation about the four centers, we spoke about the two higher centers in the fourth way terminology, higher emotional and higher intellectual center. And this diagram illustrates that the higher emotional center is self-consciousness. That's where self-remembering leads. And you can see on the top right there is sort of a little opening from the emotional center that brings us to the higher emotional center. It's the gateway of self-remembering to the higher emotional center, which is now, as I said, a different dimension. It surrounds, it encompasses. It's the field inside of which the four centers are operating. And the higher intellectual center is passing through yet another threshold, is an even higher dimension. It encompasses the higher emotional center. And the higher intellectual center is associated with what would be called objective consciousness, whereas the higher emotional center is self-consciousness. And these are the degrees of consciousness, and the four lower centers, that circle there with just all the eyes, that really represents what the fourth way calls men number 1, 2, and 3, meaning those in whom men number 1 are those in whom the instinctive and moving center are predominant. Men number 2, or people number 2, represent those in whom the emotional center is predominant. And men number 3 represent people in whom the intellectual center is predominant. They are all on the same level, and they all exist within the second state of consciousness. What the fourth way system calls a man number 4, said to be a product of a school. A man number 4 is where observing eye has established itself, has taken a significant stronghold or foothold in relation to all the other eyes produced by the four centers, and is now, you could say, conscious of itself, but it's still inside the second state. It's still inside the eyes, even though it's seeing more clearly and recognizing that it is seeing them more clearly. Seeing all the eyes, that is. And Amen number 5, according to the fourth way, represents someone in whom the higher emotional center has started to awaken. Now there's consciousness beyond, outside of, and encompassing the four centers, encompassing the second state, and is in a higher state, a higher dimension, a more expanded dimension of consciousness. And again, higher intellectual center being even further expansion or dimension of consciousness is what the fourth way system calls Amen number 6. And this just shows again all the centers with the state of self-consciousness or degree of self-consciousness and a higher degree objective consciousness above it. And notice all the eyes are gone, the many eyes. This doesn't mean they don't exist. What it means is that now, if someone were in this, if this was representational of the being, the inner being of a person who's self-conscious and objectively conscious, which would be the ultimate height which a human being can reach, then what this means is anytime an impulse arose from any of the four centers, it would no longer take shape as a feeling of I. It might start to do that, but it would not have enough substance because there'd be no identification. The more conscious you become, the less identified you are with all these eyes. And conversely, the less you identify with all the eyes in yourself, the more conscious you become. And so in this instance, the impulses would still arise, the centers would still work the way they work, but there'd be no identification. So no sense of I could really take shape any longer, and that this would mean the absence of the ego. This diagram kind of shows that absence of ego. Not absence of impulses, not absence of thoughts, emotions, feelings, sensations, but the absence of identity associated with them. And what might be thought of as identity would now be self-consciousness and or objective consciousness. And it's not a feeling of I. It is an awareness of being that expands, broadens, and deepens.